All right, we're ready for 7.2a. Notice the big red book. So if you do not have your In Success book like the board showed this morning, you need to ask for permission to go to your locker and get it, because it's important that you have this, because this is the only place you're going to find this lesson. So once again, with Go Math, that is for multiple states to use in teaching math, but there are some standards that are just particular for Indiana. So it's the Indiana Success book, because these can be expected to be found on your standardized tests. This lesson is all about properties. Now, once again, I'm going to do a lot of talking and explaining, and in order to truly learn, we have to be engaged. And to be engaged means I'm thinking about, right? My thinking brain is working, my eyes, my ears. We've talked about thinking. Our distracting brains, some of you like me have struggles with your distracting brain interfering quite often. The best way to make sure that you're not letting your distracted brain take control is by taking notes. So even though I may not write something down, it's good for you to take notes. I'm going to do a lot of explaining of 4 different properties here in a moment. Take some notes. I've given you the basic information on the piece of paper as well as on Canvas. Those are the tools that you can use, doing your homework, doing your mid-chapter checkpoint, doing your test. On all 3 things, you can use the tools I give you. The 2 things you cannot use your tools on is NWEA and standardized testing. But if you take extra notes while I'm explaining something that I say that you don't see written on your paper, and you're like, that might be important, or I like that idea, then write it down. The best way to do well and to understand is by engaging yourself. I'm always taking notes when I'm at meetings and presentations and things like that. I'm always taking notes. That way I know my brain is actively focused on what's being talked about. It's not about, okay, I'm going to turn on my video and I'm going to think about the video games or my text messages or what's going to happen for lunch, and then I'm going to try to do the assignment. You got to be engaged with me. Okay, so you can rewind this, watch as many times as you want, but it's here for you to use from this point forward. Our properties that we're going to talk about, they have some big words that are a little scary. I agree. You look at commutative, you look at associative, identity, not too bad. I know what the word identity means. And distributive, we've learned about distributive and we've talked about distributive several times. So the first 3 are an introduction for the first time that we're going to use from this point to the end of the school year. Distributive is a review because we've already used it since, I think, the 3rd week of school. In order to understand what these words mean, I need to know what the root word is, right? We've talked about root words, how we have some Greek words and some Latin words that we have our root words from. But these are big, expanded words from some basic words such as commutative comes from the word commute. Now, if we don't know what commute means, then that gets confusing. So that's what that paper or that tool is that has the image for you. If I'm going to commute, then I know I'm going to travel, I'm going to move. You all commuted this morning to get here to school. To commute means to travel, to move. You either got into someone's vehicle to get here, or you got on the bus to get here. When your parents go to work, they get in their vehicle, or if they carpool, they get in someone's vehicle, and they travel from home to their job. They're going to commute, they're going to travel. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about the commutative property of mathematics. Now, these are only going to work with addition and multiplication. I can do addition and multiplication in any order, and I'm still going to get the same answer. And that's the key to all of these. As long as I get the same answer, then I know that it's going to work. If I switch my subtraction around, if I switch my division around, I get a completely different answer. So that does not work. So these are the commutative property, but only for addition and multiplication. It's telling us that if I have 12 plus 7 and I switch those around, I commute those numbers and I do 7 plus 12, I'm going to get the same answer. In multiplication, if I have 4 times 9, but I switch or I commute those numbers, I make them travel, and I do 9 times 4 instead, I'm going to get the same answer. You'll often see me do that when I work video or work math problems, because if I have something like 4 times 22, I don't like having my 4 on top of my 22, even though that's the order it was listed in. I prefer having my 22 on top of my 4. That's commutative property. I'm just moving them, I'm making them travel to where it's easier for me to do my math. And that's what this entire lesson is about, how I can move numbers around to make my life a little bit easier. When I'm talking about this though, there's a key every single time. The sum is always going to stay the same if it's addition, or the product is always going to stay the same if it's multiplication. If I did subtraction, let's go back to 12 and 7 and say there was subtraction in the middle between those numbers. 12 minus 7 is one number, but if I switch those around, 7 minus 12 is a negative number, and that is not the same value at all. So that's just not going to work. When I talk about the associative property then, its root word or its main word is to associate. We all like to associate, right? We get with our friends, we get in our little groups, we like to chat at recess or at lunch or, during downtime when we're doing our work. And that's all associative means, is that we're going to get in a group. We're going to move them around sometimes for commutative, or we're just going to separate from this group to the next group with parentheses so that I know that my math is going to be easier. The key to it is, though, I'm never going to change my sum. I'm never going to change my product. Okay, so we've talked about the order of operations, right? So I know that if I have parentheses, I have to do those first. If I have 5 plus in parentheses 8 plus 14, and I do my parentheses and then add 5, I could change where my parentheses is because it's all addition in that problem. I could do 5 plus 8 and then add 14. I'm going to get the same value. That's the whole key to it. Wherever the parentheses are, as long as it's all addition in the math problem, or it's all multiplication in the math problem, I can change where those parentheses are and still get the same answer. But that's the key. The sum is always going to stay the same. The product is always going to stay the same. If I have some addition and some multiplication in the problem, and I want to switch my parentheses around, that's not going to work because that changes my order of operations completely. It all has to be addition or it all has to be multiplication. And once again, associative properties do not work with subtraction and division. Identity property, well, identity's root word is identity. Okay, and we know what identity is, right? You can look at yourself and you know your identity, you know what you are. So the identity property is going to tell me what it is. We have 2 constant identity properties in mathematics. One deals with addition and one deals with multiplication. The addition is adding of 0. Adding of 0 does not change the identity of the number. The multiplication one is multiplying by 1. Because if I multiply by 1, it does not change the identity of the number. So basically what we're saying is that in the identity property is that the number that's given, that's its identity. It's not going to change. When I have 13 plus 0, it's still 13. When I have 4 times 1, it's still 4. The identity is the number that math is going to. Subtraction doesn't work the same. Division doesn't work the same. As long as my number is staying the same, then I know the identity property is being used. The distributive property is the one that we've done for several months now. And some of you still get a little confused on it. It's when we did the greatest common factor and we looked at these 2 numbers that were being added or subtracted. And then we said, well, what's the greatest common factor? We're going to take those out. To distribute means I'm going to go into it or I'm going to come out of it. So I've got two examples for you. This one shows how the distributive property is going in. Now we haven't gotten into negative numbers yet, and this is not my image, but it was a good example of the distributive property, so that's why I used it. Outside of the parentheses, if a number is touching parentheses, once again, I imagine that there's a multiplication sign there because that's all it is. A number touching parentheses is always multiplication. So the distributive property means I'm going to take the -6 and multiply it by the h. I'm going to take the -6, I'm going to multiply it by the -3. When I talk about distributed into, then in the reverse is I would distribute out of. The distribute out of is what we've talked about several times. So when I have 81 plus 99, then I'm looking for that greatest common factor. What is the largest number that will go into 81 and 99? Well, that would be 9. So I'm going to distribute out a 9. When I have that 9, then I'm going to say, well, 9 will go into 81 9 times. So I create my parentheses. I've started with addition. I'm going to end with addition. And when I took the 9 out, 9 went into 81 9 times, and 9 went into 99 11 times. No matter what, I'm still going to get the same answer. If I just did the original math problem of 81 plus 99, I'm going to get the same answer as if I distribute those out and I added 9 plus 11 and then multiplied it by 9. For some, that's going to make it easier for you to do the math because 20 times 9 is 180. And for some of you, you're like, well, I'm just going to add those together and that's 180. Same answer, right? So if my product's not going to change when I put them together. So working through these then, once again, take your notes. You have these notes available for you, but take your notes inside your book so you can follow along. You have to decide what the property is they're showing you, or you have to tell me some properties that you could use to change things around. Once again, the idea is trying to make some math a little bit easier to do. And for some of you, it doesn't make it easier. Here's the thing. If you get the right answer, then I give you credit because there's more than one way to do a math problem. This is just showing you what your mind is doing sometimes when you group things together or when you move numbers around in a math problem. When you're doing that mental math, this is what your brain's doing. You just didn't know there was a name for it. So let's look at what we have. It says find the properties defined 24 plus 28 plus 26. And so they show you, well, I have 24 plus 28 plus 26. Some people in their mind, and this is the way my brain works, I see that 4 and 6 make a group of 10, right? So in my mind, I'm like, well, that makes a group of 10. So I'm actually going to put those together first. So what they're showing you is we're going to do the commutative property, and we're going to reorder where these go. We're going to switch because I want to put my 24 with my 26 since that makes a group of 10 evenly. And then my 2 plus 2 is 4 plus that 1 from the 10, that's 5. So that's 50, right? Then that leaves me with my 28. So what I did, what I talked through was the associative property when I said, well, then 4 and 6 is my group of 10. 2 plus 2 is 4 plus that 1 is 26, right? So if I add those together, that's my associative property because I did that first. Then I said, well, then I'm left with 28. So after I go through that process and I get my 50, then I'm saying, well, then my last math step is just math, right? I don't have to do any other properties there. That's just 78. So that's my final answer. Now, this is what some of you are going to think. Wouldn't it be easier to just stack 24 and 28 and 26 and line them up and add my 1s and carry and then add my 10s? For some of you, it will be easier. And that's fine with me as long as you're not asked to do these different properties. But if you're asked to do the different properties, then you have to do the different properties. So it depends on how the math question is set up. All right, so let's look at this one. It says to use the distributive property to find the product of 8 times 59. And some of you are like, well, I'm just going to take 8 times 59. That would be okay if it was a normal math problem, but it says you need to use the distributive property. So you have to show me the distributive property because that's what the question asks for. So when I have 8 times 59, this is the one where in a couple of lessons ago, actually several lessons ago, we took the whole number that we were multiplying the 8 by and we separated it. So when I look at the 59, I can separate that into 2 groups. One that is in the tens value, so because there's a 0 in the ones, and then I'm left with the 9. Well, I should know that 50 plus 9, right, is the 59. So if I have this, then I'm going to distribute my 8 inside. So I'm going to take my 8 times my 50. I'm going to take my 8 times my 9. I'm going to leave that addition sign in between them. So when I break those apart, I have 8 times 50 plus 8 times 9. What I'm showing is I can distribute my 8 in. For some people, this is going to make the math easier. And some of you are like, that seems so much more difficult than just multiplying them together. If it doesn't ask you to do the distributive property, then just do the regular math. But if it does ask for a property, then you have to do the property that's mentioned. When I take 8 times 50, then the reason it would make it easier is because I can say that 8 times 5 is 40 without a problem. And if there's a 0 there, I just add a 0 at the end. Well, if 8 times 5 is 40 and add a 0 at the end, then 8 times 50 is 400. And 8 times 9, I know my multiplication of 9 is that's 72. And now I just add those two numbers together, 472. When I look at this one here, it says, well, I could also do distributive, but I could do some subtraction. Because instead of doing 59, in my mind, if I multiplied 8 by 60, that would be a lot easier. The 60 is 1 more than 59, so when I get done, I have to subtract a 1. Some of you are like, why in the world would I ever do that? For some people, this is an easier way to get to the answer than it is to just multiply them together. If I know that 60 minus 1 is 59, then I can go through the same process that we did up here, but with a larger number, remembering to subtract at the end. Because I can say that 8 times 60 and 8 times 1 gives me two different numbers. And 8 times 6 is 48, plus a 0 at the end, so just 480. And 8 times 1 is just 8. And if I subtract those, then I get the exact same answer I got here. So with the distributive property, there's two ways I can do it. And either way is correct. Which one is easier for you? If you say, well, just multiplying those the way it's written is easier for me, that's not okay for this lesson because it says you need to use a distributive property. So you have to be able to show me that you know how to do the distributive property. The associative property, remember what we said about to associate means to put into groups. Notice the problem they gave you. So we have, equations. Once again, equations are math problems with an answer, right? This is an expression because it's a math problem without an answer. So this expression says 4 cubed or 4 to the 3rd power times 5. So what am I going to do mathematically? Well, the associative property says, well, if I know how to put things in groups, my life becomes easier. So if I know that 4 cubed or 4 to the 3rd power is 4 times 4 times 4, which hopefully you do now, and then I put those in groups because once again, if I use groupings of tens, any number with a 0 at the end, my math can be much easier to solve. So I'm going to say, well, it's all multiplication, so let's do an associative property. Let's put them in 2 equal groups, 4 times 4, but then I know 4 times 5 is that grouping of 10 where the 0 is at the end, because 4 times 4 is 16, and 4 times 5 is 20. Well, if I know in my mind that 2 times 16, which is easier math than trying to figure out 20 times 16, 2 times 16 is 32, and that 0 is at the end, then all I have to do is put a 0 after my 32, and I know I'm going to get 320, right? My other math would be, well, I have to take 4 times 4 times 4 times 5. For some, putting in groups is going to be easier. In this problem, it says you have to use the associative property, so you have to use the associative property for this question. This just says use properties. So since they started for me, I have to figure out what they're trying to show me here. So it says, well, here's 4 times 23 times 25 is the original expression, right? Once again, expression does not have an answer to it. Equations, math problem, followed by an answer. This expression, and all of a sudden I have a space here. So I know that's the commutative property because I switched positions, right? So I'd have to write on the line there, commutative, and then I have to put my 4 there. Then they add a parentheses because they're telling me if I get a grouping of 10, or in this case 100, my life is easier because I can just add zeros to my answer. So when I put them in groupings, then I am associating them together for an easier number. So the associative, once again, puts them in groups. And 4 times 25, well, 4 quarters is equal to 100. So all I have to do then, when I have a grouping of 10 or a grouping of 100, is take those zeros and add them to the end of the number. That's where it really makes these problems a lot easier. 2 zeros added to 23 is 2,300. That makes it a little easier. This says use properties to find the sum or product. So I could use multiple properties, right? I could just use one property. Just depends. Right? One of the easiest properties that I would see right away is I'm adding 0 here. That's an identity property because 11 is not going to change at all. But let's look at some numbers I can group together. Once again, my brain always goes to groups of 10s. So when I see a 9 and a 1 in my ones columns, I know that automatically becomes a group of 10. So in my mind, I switch the order of those anyway. If it's a long problem like this, I'm writing it out on paper. I still do that. I'm a math teacher, right? I have a math degree from college. I still, on my papers, will write them and switch them the orders and make that a commutative property. When I do that then, and I put the 11 and the 89 together, because that gives me a 0 at the end, which makes it easier to work with, right? Then I always start there, because I like that grouping of 10. And so that's the associative property. And the associative property says, hey, I can put those and do that math before I do any others. And as I told you, adding 0 is the identity property. Well, I said that 0 plus 11 is 11, that's identity, which is true. But since I moved the 27 down next to the 0, it's still the identity property because 0 plus any number is still that number. That never changes. When I add those together and I get an even 100 plus 27, that math is much easier than this math, right? 89 plus 27 plus 11, and some of you want to do that in your brain and you kind of forget to carry a number here or borrow here, and when you're doing subtraction, I have 100 and I have 27, that I can do fairly easy. End up with 127. Now, when I have this number for this equation, excuse me, I said the wrong word, expression, then there's only one option that I can do, right? There's only one property option that I can do, and that's distributive. So I'm going to take and I'm going to distribute my 52. I'm going to break that up. All right, so what can I break that up to? Well, I like groups of 10s, so I know I'm going to have a 0 in my ones column. So I'm going to break that up into 50 plus 2. All right, so when I do 50 plus 2, I put that inside my parentheses, and then distributive property. You don't have to have the multiplication sign, but some people still forget that a 9 touching parentheses means I'm multiplying. So I continue to add that for you to remind you that that just means multiplication. So then when I distribute in, my math should become pretty easy because it's not in my mind, do I know what 50 times 9 is? It's not that at all. It's what is 9 times 5? 45. Right. Add a 0 to it. What's that? 450? Absolutely. So when I get 4 times 5, 45, and I add that 0, 450, then I distribute the 9 times the 2, which is 18. Now, I can just add those together. 450 plus 18 is 468. All right, so we're going to first have to do our order of operations with our exponents, right, which is where we started with 7.1. So I know that that looks like 5 times 5 times 5, and I know that because my base is 5, but my exponent tells me to write the base 3 times. So I end up with 2 times 5 times 5 times 5. Now, I can start going from right to left, but if I think, well, 2 times 5, that gives me a grouping of 10, that makes my math a lot easier, then I'm going to do my associative property, and I'm going to group those together. Because when I have 2 times 5, which is 10, and I have 5 times 5, which is 25, then all I have to do is add 1 0 to the end of my number, and it gives me 250. What about these? It says complete the equations and tell which property you used. So to complete the equation, all it's telling me to do is fill in the blank and then explain which property. It's not asking you to solve the equation. And every year I have people that aren't paying much attention to me here, and then they get to these on the homework and they solve them. It's not asking you to solve, it just wants you to fill in what's missing and then tell which of the 4 properties you use. So I have 9 times, in parentheses, 30 plus 7. And then I've got 2 sets of parentheses. Well, this is multiplication and addition together. So there's only one property that we use where we had 2 different math functions together. So if I look at it, I'm taking 9 and I'm distributing it into the parentheses. So 9 times the 30 and 9 times the 7, leaving the addition in between them. So what property is that? That's my distributive property. 0 plus something equals 47. Easy enough. 0 plus any number as itself has to be 47, and we know that's our identity property. All right, so that's the lesson. It's a lot of words and a lot of definitions, and I've given you the tools to know them. But if it asks you to use properties and tell what properties are being used, you have to do it. If it doesn't, if it just says solve the equation or solve the expression, then just solve it. But if it says you have to identify specific properties, then you have to do those properties. Your assignment is going to be on the board, and as always, if you have questions, please come and ask.